So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 8th Zoom talk given by cognitive semantic authors. I'm Du Jing, one of the 3 editorial assistants. Today, we are glad to have Dr. Stalker with us. So he will give us a talk entitled Toward an Embodied Cognitive Semantics. So before his talk, let me briefly introduce Dr. Stalker. Dr. Kurt Stalker is a senior researcher of psychology at the University of Zurich and a project leader for consciousness studies at the ETH Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich. Additionally, he is also a research associate for psychopharmacology research. He investigates how the mind works. His initial contributions on the workings of the mind focused on ordinary states of consciousness and involved theoretical work as well as empirical work. Over the last years, his research focus has shifted from how the mind works in ordinary states of consciousness to how it works in non-ordinary states of consciousness. Okay, now let's warmly welcome Dr. Stalker. Kurt, the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you so much, Millie, for the nice introduction. And also would really express my sincere thanks to Thomas, the editor-in-chief of Cognitive Semantics, for giving me this opportunity. It's sort of really, and feel really honored to, get such a stage for one article that I wrote. So I really appreciate that. So yeah, so let's get started. I guess I'll take over the screen. Hope that everything, maybe first we will try to go into the full screen mode here. Just a second. Yeah. So that would be done. And now let's hope that works. Do you just see one slide?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that works. That's always the thing that makes you most nervous when the technology works. So again, thank you so much. Yeah, so the first part will be a tiny bit interactive before we then really get going. So the first part, feel free, to also, I might not see the chat because in the mode I'm in, so I could only answer to chat questions in the second half. But we thought that the talk will last anywhere between 40 minutes, 1 hour, and then we have enough time for discussion. So then I can also look at the questions in the chat maybe before the discussion. Yeah, but if you want to interact in the beginning, because right now I don't see the chat, then please just quickly turn on your mic and speak. That will be much easier. It's also easier for me to get into the talk and not have to look at the comments at the same time. So if that's okay for you, we would do it like this. So, if you look at the first slide, I guess many of you will recognize the picture on the left, because, it's this book that it's basically the culmination of decades of work by Leonard Tellme. Comes in 2 volumes, so that's just volume 1. That's the one I'm most familiar with, and that's the one part that I also try to develop to so-called embodied cognitive semantics. So if you look at it, and I know that Thomas is very familiar with the book because he, as far as I remember, he was in charge of translating these 2 volumes into Chinese. So. And I think it's a very, very worthwhile endeavor, because for me, this is maybe the most important cognitive science book that I can think of from the last or this decade, because it really sets a fundamental theory out for the psyche, not just for linguistics, but for psychology as well. Yeah. So, but then if you look at the title again, I'm not, when I was back in I was a visiting scholar in Berkeley for 2 years. And so I met Len Tellme about every 3 or 4 months in Berkeley. And we talked about so many aspects of this book. But I think I never asked him why he chose this picture on the book. So, but then for me, it seems kind of clear. If you look at the top of the head, there is more sort of a imagery, like the mind has images. And if you look at the bottom, although this is kind of dying out because it's an old typewriter, the insides of an old typewriter. So it basically seems to suggest that, our mind works sometimes more in like imagery-like ways, but sometimes also in more verbal, language-like, propositional ways. But they both kind of are deeply interconnected, so to speak. But if you also look at it, it's kind of still was, that was published in 2000, where embodiment was not such a big issue yet. If you look at it, what is depicted in relation to the mind? It's the head. So in a way, probably it also seems to suggest that most of this cognition that takes place, or this cognitive semantic cognition, if you will, takes place in the head. But the recent findings show us that we probably should expand the cognitive realm that we process, and it's mainly pretty much, it starts from the upper body. The upper body, including arms, eyes, and so on, are really an important part of cognition too. So that's why I put the other picture there, the man stretching out the arms, a famous drawing from Leonardo da Vinci, just to say maybe we should expand it from the head and also include at least the upper body. Sometimes, legs and things play a part as well, but it seems that most of the time, if not all of the time, our upper body is involved, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to move it. So otherwise, we would have to gesture all the time. But we can capture what's going on in more subtle ways. For example, by measuring eyes. What do they do? What do the eyes do when we cognize things? Things like this. So that's the basic stage, and basically, I'm going to talk about, of course, mainly about this article that I was invited to talk about, called Toward an Embodied Cognitive Semantics. But then just recently, then I kind of, after that, there was culmination of this theory that's in there took me about 6 years or so to develop. And then I kind of moved more and more into psychology. And the last few years I've been mainly involved in psychology. So only recently I've come back to writing cognitive semantic articles, and it just happens now that 2 of them are in press. And so, but these are really basically just follow-up theoretical work that relate to this 2015 article. So one of them is called Cognitive Semantic Concept Structuring in Visual Perception, Visual Imagery, Identifying a New Basic Top-Down Processing System for Visual Experience. So if you look at this title, he's trying to move away from language. He wants to apply cognitive semantic exclusively to the visual realm. And so that's the idea of that article. That, of course, doesn't mean that things will always, when you see things, you have inner speech and things like that. But just in principle, the idea is that in principle, cognitive semantics can also work in so-called visual experience, that it would be an umbrella term for visual perception and or visual imagery. And then, since I've been mainly involved in so-called, some people call them non-ordinary states of consciousness, or to call them altered states of consciousness. Lately, I've called them more non-ordinary state of consciousness. These are just basically states of consciousness which are non-ordinary, that can be induced by things like deep meditation, or things like hyperventilation, days of fasting, and they can also be caused by or induced by so-called psychedelics. So these are specific chemical compounds that we know, and I'm just going to talk about classic psychedelics in this respect. We know that they all stimulate a certain receptor in the brain, 5-HT2A receptor, and they do interesting things to Italian concept structuring, I think. So we're going to look at this a tiny bit too. And just, you know, for some people, it's still a kind of taboo word. And so if you're not really familiar with the recent literature, you might think, oh, what, talking about psychedelics in such a talk? But the thing is that there has been, we really need to distinguish between medical and legal use in laboratories. And when people take it recreationally, then it can get, it's in very rare cases, it can get dangerous, but nothing really happens in the modern clinical setting. And these substances are really now researched much as modern medicines against depression, anxiety, addiction. And so I think, as Millie might have mentioned, I'm also working as a research associate at the clinical pharmacology and at the University Hospital in Basel as a research associate. And there I mainly study these states, non-ordinary states of consciousness. So we have lots of healthy volunteers that take these substances in controlled settings. But the long-term idea of these studies is to develop them into medicines. Just to give you one idea, for example, if major depression, about 30% of people suffering from major depression, we have no solution. That means none of their standard medications, antidepressants or standard therapies work much. So you then have people suffering decades and decades and decades from so-called treatment-resistant depression. But then if they're cured, if they're giving a psychedelic treatment in these clinical trials, often you see major improvements, like more than half of the cases of so-called treatment-resistant depression. And so then that sometimes even lasts for 4 years, just having one single dose of application of such a medical substance. So I think it's really worthwhile to look at this too. And so for me, it was very interesting to analyze it from a cognitive semantic viewpoint. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about this too. So basically today we would do a journey through basic workings of the mind from what we could call the ordinary states of consciousness. It's basically the cognitive ground that, for example, people like Len Telmy covers, cognitive ground that journal like Cognitive Semantics most of the time covers. By that we just mean regular waking consciousness. So we're going to look at this in relation to thought, visual perception, visual imagery. And then we're going to look at two specific non-ordinary states of consciousness quickly, visionary and so-called mystical experience. So since we kind of want to look at the mind, I think one of the best ways to start off looking at the mind is your own mind. So what we can do, whenever there's a blank slide, I have a short little mental task. And if you want to, you can do this. And, of course, you don't have to. But, it's nothing. These are very harmless little cognitive scientific exercises, if you will. So nothing like Freudian going into your psyche or something like this. So very harmless. So in case you want to go along, then do so. Otherwise, it will not take long. So the first thing, if you want to join in quickly, because we're going to talk about the mind, so why not start off with your own mind? If you want to, we're now going to retrieve two memories. And so for that, if you want to, your own personal memories, nothing detailed or anything. So if you want to go along, you could also quickly close your eyes, because it will be easier to retrieve the mental material, but whatever. So the first thing I would ask you is to remember this morning when you had breakfast. So you might say, hey, I don't eat anything for breakfast. So then just remember the first time you took a liquid. And so just try to go back to that event with your memory capacities and try to make a really clear memory image of just one snapshot while you had breakfast. I give you a few seconds for this. Try to make such an image, please, if you want to go along with it. Okay, and so the next thing will be to try to go back much further in your own life, like something like kindergarten age, so maybe something like the age 5 or 6 or so, and just try to remember anything, you know, from that age span, and also try to make a clear mental image, a static one, sort of a snapshot, not like a film, rather sort of a snapshot. Okay, that will be that. So now, if you recall, we can then maybe talk about it in the discussion too, if you have any more questions about it. But basically, what usually happens is when you retrieve a personal memory, from a mental perspective viewpoint, there are two basic options. Option number one is that you recall the memory as if you still were in your body. That means, you know, for example, if I, for example, drink tea in the morning, so if I had to do this memory task, I would probably think, oh, I drink tea. So, but then the cup would really come, like in the memory, would really come like this toward me, because in the memory, I still look out through my eyes. So it's basically an embodied mental perspective. It's just a basic perspective that we also have in the real memory. So that kind of looking through as if you were in your body, looking out of your eyes perspective. So for example, it's called the field perspective in memory research. That often happens with very recent memories. So chances are that at least some of you have retrieved the breakfast memory from this, let's just call it the embodied mental perspective point. And then often but there's no, you know, we are no machines, so it can't just be that you cognize it, although it's a fresh memory from an outside perspective too. So you would have seen yourself from the outside, or what often also happens, it kind of shifts between an embodied and this. So but if you see yourself from the outside, then there's only a mental viewpoint left. So you're not there in the memory, it's just your viewpoint watching you from the
Sorry,
outside.
Kurt.
Yep.
So are you still sharing your screen? Because we can only see a blank sheet.
Yeah, that's good, because we still talk about your mind.
Oh, okay, good.
Great,
Sorry.
thank you. So I can put this one here. So we're basically talking about the breakfast memory. So, and then the idea is that in the kindergarten memory or early childhood memory, it's more likely that maybe you have seen yourself from the outside. So basic story is we either have an embodied perspective point or a disembodied perspective point. Is that so far clear for everybody? You would have to talk if because I don't see the notes right now. Okay, so you know we're going to build up on this a bit now. And now the next two tasks, and then we really start going with the slides. They are very how shall I say it? They won't take long. So here's just ask you to listen to what I say. Also, all you have to do is to listen. She sat in the rocker near her bed and looked out the window. How lovely the sky was. So that one is from Leonard Tell Me. And if you now in case, I just said, listen to it, but it could well be that you had some mental imagery spontaneously while listening. And chances are that when you heard the first sentence, she sat in the rock near bed and looked out the window, that then you kind of had a mental viewpoint, also a disembodied one, which you can then kind of watch the woman or saw the woman probably from somewhere in the room. I think Len also calls it like the point there, somewhere in the room. So, similar to seeing yourself from the outside, so you can also see other people from the outside. But now the interesting thing is, so if from a linguistic viewpoint, the first sentence is in very objective terms. And so that kind of induces an external perspective, but then it becomes totally subjective, so subjective that not even the pronouns are here anymore. How lovely the sky was. So, but often happens, I mean, Len says that this is what should happen in his book, and I don't know a study, but I've done it with probably dozens of students, and it seems to be induced quite reliably, that then there is a shift in your perspective. So then you most likely see yourself, you also then look out the window and see the sky in your mind. So in a way, what you have done, you have kind of re-embodied your perspective point into the woman that was there. So that shows that the perspective, so we call that thing the perspective point, taking that term over from official terminology. And so you see, it can be sort of hovering in space, mental space somewhere, but it can also sort of embody itself into yourself or also into other people. And then there's one last one, just to show the basic principles. Again, the idea is just to listen. The cliff wall faces out toward the butte. And here the idea is that you might have relocated your perspective point so that that you kind of aligned with the cliff wall, so you might, and then you would sort of look in the same direction that the cliff wall faces in your mind. And the basic story of all this is that the perspective point, it will be a psychological vantage point, which can encompass that a term perspective point can encompass both how physical or mental eyes look out upon a scene. And so the basic, so this will be quite important for the rest of the talk. So the basic things here is just that it can be embodied within oneself, the perspective point. We're always only talking about the mental world here. It can be embodied within somebody else, or it can also be sort of relocated and co-located with even inanimate entities, like for example, a cliff. And so then if you had such a, you don't see yourself there because you're not there mentally, but your mental viewpoint still might be there. Okay, so here we move on to embodiment. So now we're going to bring it all together, but it's important that we have this perspective point. Is almost the main concept that we're going to look at today. So embodiment can be defined as mental processing in the brain that is strongly and systematically influenced by the sensory and motor system. All sounds very abstract, but then one example is, for example, eyes are not just sensory organs, but also thinking organs. But then you might think, oh, well, what does that mean? But we're going to get to that in a minute. I give you a concrete example how eyes might be involved in thinking. So you see, not just the brain, eyes too can be thinking organs. So is the claim. But give me a minute to build up the claim. And so cognitive semantics. So how should we define this then? I thought maybe just approach it very broadly. So it studies definitely conceptual mental content and conceptual mental structure, and often does so in terms of their organization in language. But also the founder of cognitive semantics, Len Terry, time and again stresses, that there will be overlap to other cognitive systems such as for example, perception. And then if you go through this book that I showed you at the beginning, if you work out extract the main cognitive semantic concept structures and systems, I think you will find 4. So the 10 main concept structures and systems. I think sometimes you also call them schematic systems, 10 schematic systems. I think, for example, when you can choose keywords in the cognitive semantics journal, I think maybe it's Thelmian schematic systems, but they all mean kind of the same thing. So there will be perspective, configuration structure, attention, and force dynamics. And we're going to look at them. So the first example we're going to look at, and that's mainly about the article towards an embodied cognitive semantics, is how they, well, it's basically about thinking, I would say. Of course, we're going to use language as an example, but then, as I also tried in another article of mine in 2012 called The Time Machine in Our Mind, I tried to stress that cognitive semantic analysis is often sort of uses language, but actually it might actually tap onto thought structure per se, not just language. So basically we call that language as an entree into thinking. And also Steven Pinker, the Harvard professor in psychology, which was another consultant during those years where I developed this theory. He has a book, for example, Language as a Window into the Mind. So it's very much that kind of approach that we're going to look at now. So but then if we somehow want to define thinking, I think one way of putting it is trying to keep it simple, is the combination and manipulation of mental representations. And then, of course, again, what are mental representations? But then we're going to see plenty of them. For example, one example would be a mental timeline. So a timeline that is represented only in your mind. And of course, there might be, for example, neurophysiological correlates, but at the end of the day, it's still it's this mysterious thing called mind, where we produce the mental, not produce, but where we can kind of where the timeline manifests. Okay, so and other empty slides that is just to maybe see if anything spontaneously is evoked in your mind. I'm going to read out this sentence, but then we're going to move on right away. Mary went to bed because she was tired. So that was the sentence. Mary went to bed because she was tired. And then it might have evoked some imagery. And so let's see. And now, of course, we're just not going to look at one single sentence to look at the theory of toward an embodied cognitive semantics, which is also the one sentence used in that 2015 article of mine. But the idea, of course, is not that it just applies to this sentence. It's meant just to be one example, and that it could apply to almost all thought, basically, because we're going to look at very basic concepts of thought, like space, time, causality, perspective. And so while not all thought has causality in it, all thought probably contains space, time, and causality. So you see, although we're going to just look at one sentence, what we should get out of it is a general theory for the mind, how you might construct thought. So basically, now, if we just quickly go back, if you just quickly reflect upon this sentence, you will see, of course, that it has kind of a spatial imagery content in it. So, you might see a Mary or a bed in your mental representation while processing this sentence. But you also see, so there's space in it, but you also see that there's time in it because one thing happens before the other. So first she's tired, then she goes to bed. And then the third thing is it also contains, of course, causality because, because it's clear that there is causality involved. So there's a cause, tiredness, and an effect going to bed. So all these things in there. So, and how can we now put this into an embodied cognitive semantic framework? That's basically the question. So here we go. The first thing would be that I have a finding. So colleagues of mine, Matthias Hartmann, Corina Mattarelli, Fred Most, and I myself, were the first ones to publish a psychological study that gave us evidence that while we think, for example, thinking about the past or the future, we probably project the mental timeline in the space just in front of us. Technically, that would be called the peripersonal space. And so that might sound abstract, but for example, if you think about gesture, so if people said, hey, Kurt, tell me about your life. And then, you know, I would start to gesture, I would say, you know, I was born in 1967, then I did this. Then at least in our culture, where we read from left to right, it would not be a surprise, you know, that I would lay out this timeline in gesture. So, but the interesting thing is what happens if people just process these things and don't use their hands? Do they still gesture? You might say, oh, well, how could they gesture? Because there are no hands. But the basic point would be they do. They just gesture out with their eye gaze into empty space in front of them. So what we found was that people, when they thought about the past, they look more to the left and down. And well, so it's culture specific. You know, there was a study in Switzerland where we read and write from left to right. And when they imagined something of the personal hypothetical future, their eyes went to the right. So basically suggests that there is a timeline that we basically gesture out the timeline with our eyes. So basically a mental timeline involves right in front of us. Of course, we don't see this because it's invisible, but unconsciously at least, we still seem to process it. And I think there were like, can't remember, maybe like 19 or so participants, and only one of them guessed the hypothesis. So all the others could not guess the hypothesis because, you know, in such a study, you always have a cover story. So they should not be influenced by the hypothesis. And so then there were a few follow-up studies confirming basically that we project the mental timeline also with our eyes. And so if you're very familiar with the work of Leonard Talmy, then you might have seen this. So he also, see, this is also a timeline there, event A, event B. And he also has a perspective point, a mental vantage point that looks onto the timeline. So all we've basically done is to give, you know, because this is so abstract. So where is it really taking place? So the idea would be, well, it basically, you know, it's just, we use our physical eyes also as mental eyes, and we project the timeline right in front of us. And that's a very culture-specific finding. So in other cultures, you know, for example, in Arabic or Hebrew cultures, the timeline runs from right to left. In some Aboriginal cultures in Australia, the timeline runs even from east to west. So, but it doesn't really matter how, but somehow, usually in some culture-specific way, the timeline is probably spatialized. And we seem to basically build that up with our eyes in front of us. So an easy way to remember all this is to say, we sum it up, is we gesture even if we don't gesture. Because if we don't gesture by hand, we still gesture it out with our eyes. So now we're basically building up now cognitive semantic theory in that peripersonal space, in the space that we can reach with our hands in front of us. And so far we have added a timeline. So now we're going to put each of the specific cognitive semantic systems onto this. And so this is basically then the 2015 article Towards an Embodied Cognitive Semantics. I simplified it a lot here because it's just, there's so much structure. So it's a mind-blowing complexity sometimes. So I just have some basics. So if you're more interested in more detail, then I refer you to the article or to the discussion. I would have the more complicated slides ready, but I won't show them during the talk. Okay, so excuse me, some water. The first point would be the perspective point is probably outside, because outside of the self, outside of the perceiver, because the timeline runs from left to right. Because equally likely the timeline, mental time could also run, we often say the future, at least in our culture, we often say the future is ahead, the past is in the back. So it could also run through us, the further in front of us, the more in the future, the more behind us, the more in the past. But it doesn't it doesn't do that. So we probably think that then the mental viewpoint is an external one. So that's why I just put this PP always stands for perspective point, and external, you see the yellow stuff that's put in, that means it's probably external, not an internal perspective point. Okay, then, so we're just gonna add bit and bit, and hope I will manage on time. I think we definitely will need about till 2 o'clock. So yeah, then the next schematic system, schematic system that we can add on is, and now it becomes a bit complicated because more and more stuff is added. So please remember, you can always just, when you look at the timeline, just look at the green stuff, because the green stuff is always the most important stuff that has been added. So here we add configuration structures or geometric delineations in mental space or time. That often can be revealed by linguistic analysis. And so here we have the time example. So we have the two events. So remember, Mary went to bed because she was tired. So actually it's an anti-sequential sentence, because what happens first is mentioned last, because first she's tired and then she goes to bed. But so, and then we just can schematize this to 2 points on the timeline. And the points are not just points because we always usually put them, we even call them time points, but by systematic analysis, you can really kind of, linguistic analysis, you can really tease out their zero-dimensional structure. So if you would be interested how this is done, then you could look at the Stocker 2012 article that is also quoted on here. But now, so that's it. But then, you might say, hey, wait a moment, because maybe before, when we had that sentence, Mary went to bed because she was tired, maybe you had imagery, you had like, maybe you saw some kind of woman, Mary woman, maybe you saw a bed or a tired face, some bits and pieces of imagery, and say, what about this? This is just an abstract timeline. So what would the theory do here? And the idea is that there is 2 kinds of times, space-times. So that's very complicated. So it's the theory of cognitive space-time of mind, which I won't go much into it here. But it's basically just, we have another kind of space-time that we usually just call space. And then what we can do is now, remember, always just look at the green, that's new. In relation to event A on the timeline, we probably have some imagery bits popping up, like Mary or so. And that means basically that you build up 3-dimensional space within your mind. So that's why there is the X, Y, Z axes. And I just attached them as these bubbles, basically, to realize that probably we have 2 cognitions kind of almost in competition, because time will be spatialized, but also probably the space stuff will also be spatialized to some extent. And so in a way it's, but nevertheless, it's still, the mental timeline still shows, although there probably is some interference from the more imagery-like material. And now the next thing to do is to add tell me with attention in 2007, he really made it much more comprehensive. So he came up with something like 10 attention categories for term and concept structuring. He identified something like 50 basic attention mechanisms. So that gets very overwhelmingly complex. But so we're just gonna look at one basic notion, which is the notion of figure and ground. So basically, very simple, establish one concept, the ground, is as a reference point or anchor for another concept, the figure. So it's always the most easiest with space, like the chair is on the floor, the floor is the reference point where the chair is kind of located or conceptualized. And so you can also do this with more abstract things like time. So if Mary went to bed would be the figure, because she was tired is sort of the reference point. As a basic general rule, in simple sentences, the subject nominal will be the figure and the object nominal will be the ground. So, then we add more and more structure, so we then add the figure and ground. And then, for example, evidence that we then that we more look at the figure than the ground is because we have from eye tracking experiments when we have two things, like, for example, the ground is often also just in the simple past. For example, the ground is just the present moment, the basic reference point. But people then don't look at the present moment at the past, but they look at the figure, the ground in the past. Okay, and now the last bit, and then we're basically through with the thinking part. That's force dynamics. Going to break this up very in a simplified way, but basically force dynamics has lots to do with causality. So, but term force dynamics is basically conceptualization of two opposed mental entities, an agonist and antagonist, that are engaged in a force interaction. And so it can get very abstract, but basically the idea is what is really behind that word, because. What does it really mean? And so basically we have one entity, which is called the agonist, that would be Mary. And, in order that we can cognize her going to bed, she first must be out of bed. So that would be the basic agonistic state. Mary is out of bed. And then the antagonist is something that wants to change the basic state or action of the agonist. So there it comes tiredness, and the tiredness carries the force of the suggestion of going to bed. And so in a successful causation, then because the antagonist is stronger, and then it basically results in Mary actually really going to bed. If the antagonist, for example, was weaker, then in language it would no longer show up as, and the agonist, Mary, would be stronger, the out of bed condition would be stronger, then it could no longer be verbalized with because, then it would be something like, although Mary did not go to bed, although she was tired. So, and then this kind of structure, you also basically they relate to the event, because we have a cause and we have an effect. So all that stuff, but then the stuff is probably more assigned to the imagistic material, because the agonist is Mary, the agonist is not event A. So the imagery that comes with it also gets some cognitive material attached to it. Okay, so this has been basically the theory of embodied toward an embodied cognitive semantics. And now I would like to show you how these same basic mechanisms of this theory can be applied to visual perception and visual imagery. So what is visual perception? So it's taking raw visual sensations from the environment, so-called bottom-up processing, and you give them meaning using knowledge, experience, understanding, and according to me, also concept structuring of the world. So that then would be top-down processing. So some material comes in through the eyes, and then you have the brain, the mind, also using experience and so on for interpretation of the stimulus. And so it's this interplay. And visual imagery, that's just something seeing with our mental eyes, basically, seeing something in our mind that is not physically present. And since there is, especially in relation to spatial and temporal and causal structures, there's a lot of overlap between visual perception and visual imagery. I summarized this up with, I need an umbrella term to be able to refer to both. So that's a visual experience. Also remember that the perspective point introduced in the beginning is also meant to apply to either looking at, with your physical eyes, but also with your mental eyes. So far, we were always, when we had something, we were always looking at language, right, or at memory. But since it's now visual perception, we just look at something, right? So we look at this. You might recognize it. It's Van Gogh's chair. And so what we will do is see how this embodied cognitive semantics, and of course now it's very obvious that it's embodied. It's much more obvious than with what we saw before in thinking, because you know how, if this is visual perception, we use our eyes anyway. So in a way, it's not such a surprise that it could also work for visual perception. And so basically, we again have a cognizer. And basically what happens is we have most likely we have an external perspective point, like we see the chair from an outside angle. But you might say, well, this is totally obvious. How could it ever be otherwise? But you know, with cognitive semantic tricks, you could actually probably induce a different perspective point but this definitely will not be the default one. But say you said something like the backrest of the chair faces Van Gogh, who is walking towards the chair. That would be very similar to the cliff example from Tell Me before. So maybe if you say the backrest chair faces them, and then you might also imagine that you might also put your mental perspective point there and looking out in the same direction as the backrest of the chair faces, because you then see your imaginary Van Gogh approaching. So just to say, this is not written in stone that it must be a total external perspective point. It can also be a perspective point that is co-located with the object. But we probably all agree that the standard one would be, you know, just seeing the chair right in front of you. And with configuration structure, now the nice thing is with visual perception, everything is so much easier than in thinking that involves also the mental timeline. So then, you know, basically what we have is just an unfolding of three-dimensional space and also of time, because if there was no time, no duration, how could we see anything? That would be the easiest way to explain it. And of course, we need the three dimensions because the stimulus that we perceive on the retina on the back of our eye, this is still two-dimensional. And it's only with the help of the brain that we can then interpret this as three-dimensional. So for example, if you look at the box behind the chair, there was no doubt for you that was behind, you know, but you know, this still has to be constructed. So basically, configuration structure, it would be the 4D space-time unfolding that you then can see that in your mind. And with figure and ground attention, this is also quite straightforward, because, you know, how would we most likely verbalize this? We will most likely verbalize this as the chair is on the floor, so subject nominal chair, on the floor, object nominal ground, so chair, figure, ground. The ground is the ground, the floor is the ground, basically. But then it's also good to remember that this is just perceptual habits we have, and not even this will necessarily be written in stone. Because first you might think, if you look at the bottom left of the slide, the floor is on the chair, that, oh, no, it definitely is an odd sentence. That's why it has got this asterisk there. But if you think about it, it's not an impossible sentence, just with a bit of imagination. you could think that this chair and this floor, that they're made, you could think that they could be made out of cardboard. So there could be like a toy chair and a toy floor. And then you would your job would be to glue the floor from below onto the chair. And then if you succeed, then you could really say something like, hey, look, the floor is on the chair now, and it sticks really quite well. And there would be nothing wrong with this sentence. But of course, experience will more likely put the chair in the foreground and use the floor as the reference point. And then we have as a final thing, we can put, doesn't have to be, but there is something that is called affordance in psychology. So that means if you perceive a visual object, sometimes you spontaneously also associate with one or more of its action options. So for example, maybe not so much with this chair because there's stuff on it and so on, it doesn't look so comfy. But still, it could be that some of you, when you have seen the picture before, also imagine some spontaneous action options, like, for example, moving the stuff away from that is lying on the chair, or just maybe even imagining somebody sitting down just very unconsciously quickly. And if that happened, this again would be a force dynamic interaction, because then you would basically conceptualize the chair as being unoccupied, not meaning there's no stuff in it, but nobody's sitting on it. But then, for example, if you imagine somebody could sit on this, then there's a different state. Then there's for example, if the imaginer would then be the antagonist, which would think it could be occupied, one could sit on it. And then if it would happen, then just in imagination, then the chair will be occupied, which just shows that it's quite, wouldn't take very much that a visual percept also has a force dynamic structure. I mean, just imagine some kind of action option that changes the basic state the object is in, and then you do have a force dynamic interaction. Okay, now we're moving on to the last bit, and then of course we might have lots of questions also on saying, but then we almost will then have a whole hour or so for questions and discussion. So far what we've done is we have added embodiment to cognitive semantics, but now already in some detail I mentioned the non-ordinary states of consciousness. And so what we will do is now we're going to look at the famous book of Aldous Huxley and see how he described that state of consciousness, and how basically it comes down to, we could maybe really say it comes down to disembodied cognitive semantics, that most of the stuff, the concept structure seems to fall away in these non-ordinary states of consciousness. So what are these? A very short definition would be a perception for the emotion that can be occasioned by meditation, sensory deprivation, sensory overload, rhythm-induced trance, psychedelics, and still other ways. And two hallmarks, so remember, we can call them non-ordinary states of consciousness, altered states of consciousness. Both terms are fairly common. And two hallmarks are so-called visionary experience and mystical experience. Now, if you're not familiar, then these terms might sound super non-scientific, but then it is the case that in psychology these states have been measured for decades, and for example, mystical experience has been described by philosophers for centuries, or even almost millennia if you take the old Hindu scriptures and so into account. So there's really quite a bit of knowledge and experience behind these terms. So, but trying to, I see that there's two chat things. We're going to look at this in the break, or just quickly see if there's anything really urgent. Yeah, great. So yeah, there will be a question answer. Yeah, now I also have the chat open because the chat's coming. But yeah, we're going to look at that afterwards. So visionary experience is seeing, sensing something with a compelling sense of reality, despite the lack of a corresponding sensory stillness. So that can happen, people in a strong ordinary state, they might, for example, see a demon that is not there, and the demon might be a manifestation of inner psychological trauma or something like this. But it still looks real. That's the thing. So we can also call it hallucination. But hallucination has a lot of theory attached to it. So I personally prefer a visionary experience. A mystical experience is just perceiving everything as one. So it's a total transcendence of the subject-object dichotomy. And of course, we're just talking here about subjective experience. If what these experiences mean in an ontological sense, goes deeply into philosophy, and it's not really the topic here. The topic is more on the phenomenological level. What do people experience, and also a bit, what effect does it have? So, let me see. Now, somehow the slides don't move on. This is funny. Oh, there we go. Yeah, and here just because now we're going to look at the experience of Aldous Huxley, who took mescaline, which is a classic psychedelic that I've mentioned. And just that there's no misunderstanding. When we talk about such studies, this is in no way meant to encourage private or illicit use of these psychedelic substances. As I mentioned, in modern laboratory studies, there is no evidence that there is that the administration is not safe, but in contrast, when taken recreationally in illicit settings, in rare cases, it can be related to risky behavior or enduring psychological distress. So just that this is clear. What I've done, so don't look at this slide in any detail, please, but what I've also done is, the tradition of measuring the non-ordinary state of consciousness is quite a long one in psychology. The first questionnaire came out in 1955. And overall, we have about, I think it's about 15 or so questionnaire types. And there's more than 2,000 questions to ask about this state. And I looked at all these questions, and still to see if it covers how Aldous Huxley covers this. And then you might say, well, why put so much focus on one single individual? But this is just hypothesis generation, because we just want to see, because Aldous Huxley, English writer, is probably most known for his novel Brave New World. But he also deeply went into the mind. So he also wrote this book, The Parallel Philosophy. And that, for example, made him, in many circles, established him not just as a writer, but also as a philosopher. And now, I hope it's okay. I will take a few more minutes than an hour, but we're really getting on. So I hope it shouldn't be longer than like 2:10. I hope you can we can take that long, because then we still have quite some time. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at Huxley, and then we're going to see what this also means in relation to embodied cognitive semantics. Okay, so I usually quote Huxley at the antipodes of the mind. We are more or less completely free of language outside of the system of conceptual thought. If you read this, completely free of language outside of the system of conceptual thought, he basically claims that concept structuring is not at work during that state. Mescaline-induced psychedelic state, for example, as one example for a non-ordinary state of consciousness. Consequently, our perception of visionary objects possesses all the freshness, all the naked intensity of experiences which have never been verbalized, never been assimilated to lifeless abstractions. So quite a claim. So now and then he basically made a report, and the good thing is, because Huxley is probably one of the most intelligent people that lived in the last century, and his language is so clear and so precise that we really it's worthwhile to look at this and see if we can learn from there. And the idea is this is not the end. The idea is just like out of this experience, we can develop some new questionnaire items and then test them with hundreds of people to see if this is generalizable. So let's look at a few things. I was looking at my furniture, not as the utilitarian who sits on chairs to write desks and tables, not as the cameraman or scientific recorder, but as the pure aesthete whose concern is only with forms and the relationships within the field of vision or picture space. So if you recall before, we talked about affordance, that quite often, if we see a chair or a desk, we think, what can we do with it? And so basically what we do, for example, if say, I see a chair, a very comfy chair that's empty, what I basically do is and then I think, oh, I could sit in there. What I basically do is I apply, at least in my mind already, a force dynamic structure on it, the chair being the agonist, empty, and I'm the antagonist, I want to occupy you. And then if I sit there, then, it's a typical force dynamic interaction taking place. And so he's basically saying that goes out of the window. You don't really look at this anymore in this thing. So now I've done this is the same drawing, but it's not the same chair as before, but it's not featuring in this article, this in Press P article, but I thought it's best to illustrate it like this. So remember, before we build up this structure, so now basically the first hypothesis is that force dynamics no longer applies. And so when going through these more than 2,000 items, I didn't really find, except for bodilessness, which comes later on, I didn't find anything that really matched these items. So I always came up with a suggestion how it could be tested in the future. So here would be something like, I saw objects without any thoughts for what the objects could be used for. And now we move on to so-called space. So there was an investigator, a psychiatrist, that Humphrey Osmond was there. What about spatial relationships, he asked. It was difficult to answer. True, the perspective looked rather odd and the walls of the room no longer seemed to meet in right angles, but these were not the really important facts. At ordinary times, the eye concerns itself with such problems as where, how far, how situated in relation to what. In the masculine experience, the implied questions to which the eye responds are of another order. Place and distance cease to be of much interest. And for us linguists that are familiar with semantics, how this is figure and ground, thinking. And so he's basically saying that also no longer applies. So then, oops, there should be an animation not working. I quickly reanimate this because the animation tried to work. Yeah, anyway. So we see then figure and ground has also been removed. And the first idea for an item would be, in what I saw, nothing was spatially foregrounded in the sense that would have stood out against the less relevant background. And then we're going to move on a bit quickly now. Then he also said that position and the three dimensions were beside the point, but that space was still there, but it has lost its predominance. So yeah, now it works again. See, then you see what happens more and more of the concept structuring, terminus concept structuring, at least in this hypothesis, generating theoretical work is removed. And so the thing is that there's so much conceptual structure involved in visual perception that we don't see, but it still seems to be there. So here the suggestion would be how objects or rooms were extended in space in relation to the length, width, or height, or depth was no longer of any interest to me. And then we come to time. So he's basically saying that he's basically then speaking of an infinite duration or of a perceptual present made out of one that continuously collapses. So in a way, he's saying that there's also no time, and there's basically just the feeling of there's always the present moment, and everything that ever happened or will happen seems to be happening in the present moment. And we're just talking about subjective experience, not about objective reality. So time would also go out of the window, basically. And then we could maybe, in future psychometric work, something like everything that ever happened is happening or will ever happen seem to occur in the present moment. He also had a clear sense of disembodiment. The body seemed to have dissociated itself almost completely from the mind. So it really feels like arms and legs no longer belong to you. So what happens here is then we still have we still have a body here. So that would also go. And see, now we're slowly moving away. So there's not much left from the concept structuring according to the basically theory almost that Huxley proposes. And so then at the end, he has this classical mystical experience. And then, of course, you know, later on there will be a video, and you can also make a screenshot if you want to look at something in more detail or discuss it. And of course, you can always go back to the slides. I'm trying to save time now. So basically then, as he looks at the chair, he basically loses all sense of self, and he just feels like his self no longer exists. And everything seems to kind of, he feels like that it's just his not self. And the chair is the same, in the same area of this not self. So very typical, the subject-object dichotomy in the mystic experience is from a subjective feeling is totally transcended. You feel no more, there's no more boundaries between the chair and you. This just everything is this oneness. So applying this to here, then so far at least we still have kind of a self, and that also seems to go away, you know. There's no sense of self, there's a no self. And so, but the interesting thing is, you know, if you would go back, if you would go back to the quote, you see, he's still, while he has this mystical experience with this chair, he is still totally gazing at the chair. So he still has a perfectly intact perspective point. And that's the thing, you know, like when in this psychedelic literature, people like that the self is no longer there, the body is no longer there, time is no longer there, and so on. That is somehow quite well known and also somewhat covered. But so for example, with the self, there's even technical terms like called the experience ego death and so on. But nobody ever says, you know, there is a mental perspective point death or anything. So, and from what I've read many reports, people, even if they have a total mystic experience, they still seem to sometimes cognize something, even from a certain angle. So it seems like the one thing that even in a totally deep, non-ordinary state of consciousness, one thing that might still be there is this disembodied mental perspective point, which I hope I was already able to introduce to you through the 3 introductory exercises. So a first draft for a question item here would be: I perceived things physically or mentally from a certain angle, but the perceiving still did not seem to belong to me, but like everything else, to an all-encompassing oneness. So at the end of the day, you know, if we look at this experience, you know, basic claim is that you can see things for while you're in that state, which of course is always temporary, otherwise it would get pathological. You can see things very freshly, very clearly, without typical concept structure overlaid with it. And that's why Huxley calls it the most extraordinary and significant experience. But then at the same time, we should also remember that concept structuring of the world is also a gift that helps us to understand the world and to act in it. But just to have a deep appreciation for concept structuring, because without it, you know, we couldn't even cross the street properly. But that does not per se exclude that sometimes a temporary break from such concept structuring, from so much overlaid concept structure, which might take away some of the freshness for the perceptual experience, might still have some benefits, you know, but that this would be just basically, you know, sometimes have a break. So, but after all, what the main point is that this concept structuring is something extremely valuable that really helps us to get along. Because now, for example, imagine crossing a street, trying to cross a street without an intact concept structuring. You know how a car would be approaching, and you know, then you know you have to apply a figure ground kind of framework to see, you know, can I still cross the street, or is it already too dangerous? And so you need to do these things. And if you are in a total mystical experience and feel that everything is one, you might even feel at one with the car, and then it will get very dangerous. So the idea is that there's basically probably space for both, you know, the ordinary state of consciousness with a beautiful concept structuring at work that helps us to get around in the world, helps us to think. But then it's not a total impossibility that sometimes getting a break from this might also be beneficial. And then for future research, it would be interesting if like these effects, that these antidepressant effects, for example, that I mentioned, maybe they have there something to do with giving us a break from concept structuring or not. That would be one research question. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for bearing with me for so long. In case you're interested in any literature, you can just take a screenshot here, you know, then you have all the literature. Yeah, okay, thank you.